Daniel stepped out of his car and paused. The house stood there, weathered but proud, its brick walls sun-faded and covered in ivy. Dust swirled in the light, settling on the windowsills and the wooden steps leading to the front door. A lump rose in his throat. This was his grandfather's home, the man who had shaped his childhood, now gone. He inhaled slowly, letting the familiar scent of cedar and old wood fill him. Memories surged forward. Summers spent in the garden, the sound of his grandfather's deep voice telling stories by the fireplace, the gentle tap of a cane against the floor. Daniel could almost hear the laughter, the lessons, the quiet wisdom. Yet the house felt empty, heavier than he remembered. His eyes instinctively sought the corner where his grandfather's cane had always stood. It wasn't there. A chill crept up his spine. That simple wooden stick had been more than support. It had been a symbol of guidance, of presence. And now it was gone. Daniel walked slowly through the hallway, brushing his hand along the railing, remembering how his grandfather had lifted him onto his shoulders for a better view of the garden. He remembered holding the cane as a boy, marveling at its smooth wood, feeling its weight, pretending to understand the words that came with it. Every step counts, Daniel. Walk with purpose. Now those words felt heavier than ever. Every moment he had postponed visits, ignored letters, or taken his grandfather for granted pressed on him like a weight. He stopped at the living room, his gaze falling on the empty armchair by the fireplace, the shelves lined with books and framed photographs. There was his grandfather's smile frozen in time, and beside him, a younger Daniel clinging to the man he admired. The house seemed alive in its own way, filled with shadows that whispered of the past. Daniel's stomach twisted with a mix of grief and longing. He had returned to handle the house, to sort through memories, but instead he felt lost among them. Every room was a reminder of what he had missed, what he could never reclaim. A shiver ran down his spine. The absence of the cane made the house feel unfinished, as if a part of his grandfather's spirit was waiting, watching, and yet unreachable. Daniel's fingers itched to touch something familiar, to connect with the presence that had meant so much. He approached the mantel, tracing the edges of framed photographs. He whispered softly to himself, words that carried both hope and despair, "I'll find you." For a moment, the sunbeam through the tall window caught on a small, unseen corner. Daniel paused. Something seemed to watch him from the shadows, something patient, something alive. And though he did not yet understand it, he felt a strange certainty. The cane, the man he had loved, and the memories they shared were not gone. He exhaled, steadying his trembling hands. This was only the beginning. Something was waiting for him in this house, something that would call him to walk not just through its rooms, but through the legacy his grandfather had left behind. Daniel turned toward the staircase, the weight of grief and memory pressing on him. And in the quiet, empty house, the journey began. The attic stairs groaned beneath Daniel's weight, each step echoing in the silent house. Dust hung in the air, golden in the afternoon sunlight that slipped through the small attic window. Wooden beams stretched across the low ceiling, and stacks of old boxes leaned against the walls, threatening to tumble. Daniel paused at the top, hand gripping the railing, and breathed in the familiar scent of old wood, paper, and memory. He remembered being a boy, carried up these same steps by his grandfather, his small hands gripping the man's shoulders tightly. "Look carefully, Daniel," his grandfather had said. "Every object has a story. Every story matters." Daniel had nodded, too young to fully understand. Now, decades later, the words felt heavy, almost prophetic. He stepped carefully between piles of boxes, brushing his hands over worn trunks and leather-bound albums. The attic was a shrine to a life lived fully, medals, journals, photographs, and trinkets that had once fascinated him as a child. Each item carried a faint whisper of the man he had loved, now gone. Then something caught his eye. Beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers, a dark outline pressed against the floorboards. Daniel knelt and carefully brushed the papers aside. There it was, a long, slender shape wrapped in a faded, worn cloth. His breath caught. He pulled it free, and for a moment, the attic seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. It was the cane. Even wrapped, it radiated presence. Daniel lifted it into his hands, and a strange sensation ran through him. It wasn't just wood and metal, it was heavier, almost alive, as if it recognized him. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the cloth, revealing the polished wood, the carved handle worn smooth from decades of use. Tiny scratches and dents marked its surface, each telling a story of someone who had walked through life with care, determination, and patience. Daniel's mind flashed to the countless times he had seen his grandfather lean on it. He could hear the tap of the cane against the floor, steady and deliberate, echoing through the hallways of his childhood. He remembered the man's deep, measured voice. A cane is not just for walking, Daniel. It carries the steps you must take and sometimes the guidance you cannot see. Daniel shivered. He had laughed at the words as a child, imagining his grandfather speaking in riddles. Now holding the cane, he felt the weight of that wisdom pressing down, heavy and undeniable. He stood slowly, testing its balance, feeling the strange energy it seemed to hum with. The cane felt almost alive, as if it were aware of his touch, aware of the hands holding it. A shiver ran down his spine. Could it be imagination? Grief twisting reality? Or something else entirely? He walked carefully toward the attic window and leaned the cane against a dusty trunk. The sunlight caught its polished wood, and Daniel's thoughts drifted again to his grandfather. Memories surfaced unbidden, the quiet mornings in the garden, the stories by the fireplace, the gentle advice whispered in the dark. He remembered the words about walking with purpose, about leaving guidance for those who came after. And now he wondered, was that guidance meant for him? Daniel sank onto an old chair, holding the cane across his lap. The weight felt comforting, familiar, yet uncanny. He ran his fingers over the surface again, tracing the tiny grooves and scratches. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why me?" His gaze drifted to a dusty corner of the attic where old journals and letters lay stacked haphazardly. He opened one, and his grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the page. The words spoke of regrets, hopes, and unspoken truths. A life recorded in careful script, full of lessons left unfinished. Daniel felt a lump in his throat, realizing how much he had missed, how little he had understood. A sudden thought struck him. Perhaps the cane had not been lost, it had been waiting for him. Waiting for the moment when he was ready to carry more than just its weight. Waiting for him to recognize the legacy his grandfather had left behind. Daniel's eyes fell once more on the polished wood. The cane seemed to hum in his hands, not literally, but with a presence that filled the attic, wrapping around him like a memory too strong to ignore. The pull was irresistible, a mixture of reverence, fear, and awe. He debated silently. Should he leave it here, hidden and untouched? Should he carry it down to the living room, or place it in some safe corner? Every instinct told him it was more than a simple object. It was a bridge, between the past and present, between life and something beyond. Finally he straightened, holding the cane upright. It felt like more than wood and metal, it felt like a call. A purpose. Daniel knew, with a certainty that startled him, that he could not walk away from it. The journey had begun, whether he was ready or not. The attic, bathed in fading sunlight, seemed to hum around him, alive with memories and quiet expectation. Daniel exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, "I'll follow you." And in that moment he felt it, the first faint step of something extraordinary, a presence guiding him forward. The cane was no longer just a memory. It was a companion, a teacher, and perhaps, a key to understanding the grandfather he had loved and lost. Daniel placed the cane carefully in the corner of his bedroom, leaning it against the wall. Its polished wood caught the dim glow of the lamp, the light reflecting off the subtle scratches that told the story of a long life. He stepped back and studied it, a strange mix of reverence and unease tightening in his chest. The cane seemed aware. Not in any ordinary way, but as if it were waiting, patient, expectant. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of the evening settled around him, punctuated by the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Shadows stretched along the walls, long and hesitant, like they too were waiting. Daniel pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and tried to calm his racing thoughts. It was just a cane, he told himself. Just wood. Just a memory. He lay down, facing the ceiling, and stared at the beams above. Every so often, a faint scratching or shifting sound came from the corner where the cane stood. Daniel's eyes flicked toward it, and he could have sworn it had moved slightly, as though adjusting its stance. His heart skipped a beat. Perhaps he was imagining it. Grief and exhaustion played tricks on the mind. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe slowly. Sleep arrived reluctantly, dragging him into a realm where memory and reality blended. In his dream he was walking through the old house as a boy. His grandfather appeared beside him, cane in hand, his presence solid and comforting. The tap of the cane echoed through the hallways, deliberate and rhythmic. "Every step counts, Daniel," the voice said, calm but insistent. "Follow carefully." Daniel looked down and saw the cane move on its own. It circled the room before pausing beside him, its tip resting lightly on the floor. In the dream it seemed alive, deliberate, guiding him. He reached out, and the cane vibrated under his fingers, not painfully, but with a subtle, almost electric weight. The dream shifted. Shadows stretched into forms he recognized. His grandfather's old coat draped over the chair, the rocking horse from the hallway, the scent of the fireplace. The house was alive, breathing around him, waiting. Daniel felt a mixture of fear and comfort. Fear of the unknown, comfort in the familiar presence he had longed for. A sudden memory pierced the dream, the day his grandfather had told him, "A cane is more than a stick, Daniel. It carries stories, guidance, and sometimes the steps of those who come after." Daniel woke with a start, heart pounding, the words echoing in his mind. The room was dark, but he could see the faint outline of the cane in the corner. It had shifted slightly, just as he had dreamed. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. Was it possible? Could grief and longing conjure something so real? Or had the cane truly moved? Daniel forced himself to rise, stepping carefully toward the corner. The cane leaned exactly where he had placed it. But the air felt different, charged, as though the attic, the house, the memories themselves had condensed around it. His hand hovered over the polished wood. It called to him, silent but insistent. He let it rest against him again, the familiar weight grounding him. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the house and the faint tapping of his own heartbeat. There was a rhythm to the night, a quiet pulse that seemed to whisper, "You are not alone." Finally, Daniel returned to bed, placing the cane where he could see it. Sleep came slowly, heavy with dreams that mingled memory and reality. He saw his grandfather walking through the garden, cane in hand, stopping to point out a path, a flower, a lesson long forgotten. The man's eyes held wisdom, sorrow, and love all at once. And every step the cane took was deliberate, purposeful, guiding Daniel toward understanding he had never sought before. Morning light spilled into the room, gentle and golden. Daniel opened his eyes, heart still heavy from the dream. The cane stood in the corner, upright, polished, patient. Nothing had changed. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something had shifted overnight, something subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. He reached out, touching it lightly, and felt the familiar weight, the quiet hum of history pressing against his palm. It was no longer just a memory. It was a presence. The house, the night, and the cane had revealed a fragment of a truth he did not yet understand. Daniel exhaled, steadying himself. The first night had passed, but he knew the journey was only beginning. The cane would not remain still for long. It had a path, a purpose, and Daniel, whether he realized it or not, was part of it. He stepped toward the window, looking out over the garden. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the leaves in a soft rustle. In the distance, the house seemed to breathe, alive with memory, waiting. And somewhere, within the shadows and the quiet, the cane waited too, ready to walk, ready to guide, ready to lead him into a journey that would change everything he thought he knew about his grandfather, his family, and himself. Daniel touched the cane once more before leaving the room, his hand lingering on the polished wood. A silent promise formed in his mind. He would follow, he would learn, and he would honor the legacy left behind, not just in memory but in every step he took. And as he finally closed his eyes to sleep, the cane seemed to lean slightly toward him, as if nodding in agreement. The first night had ended, but its mystery had only just begun. The next morning, Daniel awoke to the soft glow of sunlight spilling across the bedroom floor. His first thought was the cane. It stood where he had placed it the night before, or so he thought. When he stepped closer, a small jolt ran through him. The cane wasn't in the exact spot he had left it. Its base was angled slightly toward the window, the polished wood catching the light as though acknowledging him. Daniel rubbed his eyes. Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps grief had clouded his perception. But a knot of unease settled in his stomach. He had promised himself he would follow the cane, but he hadn't realized it would begin moving before he even left the room. He made coffee and wandered through the house, trying to convince himself the cane was stationary. But every time he glanced in its direction, he noticed subtle changes, tilted angles, slight shifts, faint scrapes against the wooden floor. By the time he finished breakfast, a sinking feeling had taken hold. The cane moved, and it moved with purpose. Daniel decided to test it. He carried the cane to the front door, intending to clean it, polish it, and return it to its corner. But later, when he returned, it was back in the living room, leaning against the armchair, exactly where he had first discovered it. He froze. His mind raced through possibilities. Was it the wind? The uneven floorboards? A trick of his memory? None of it explained the unmistakable sense that the cane had walked there on its own. Curiosity outweighed fear. Daniel began documenting the cane's movements, noting the positions in the house at different times of the day. Sometimes it was near the fireplace, sometimes by the window, occasionally leaning against the bookshelf. Patterns began to emerge, places that had been important to his grandfather, spots where Daniel remembered the man had spent hours reading, writing, or simply sitting in quiet contemplation. It was as though the cane was guiding him, retracing steps of a life he had barely understood. Every shift, every subtle movement felt deliberate, purposeful. And with every observation, Daniel's grief mingled with awe. He felt a connection he hadn't known he needed, a sense that his grandfather was still present, still leading him even from beyond. One evening, Daniel followed the cane silently through the house. He watched it move from the kitchen to the hall, pausing briefly before the stairs, then continuing toward the study. His heart pounded. It wasn't a hallucination, it was deliberate. The cane wasn't just moving, it was walking, choosing paths, returning to familiar places as though it remembered decades of footsteps. Daniel leaned against the wall, whispering to himself, "Why are you showing me this?" The cane stopped in front of an old wooden desk, the one where his grandfather had spent countless hours writing letters, balancing finances, and planning for the family's future. Daniel ran his hand over the polished surface, imagining the man sitting there, cane in hand, pen in the other, deep in thought. He felt the weight of history, of legacy, pressing down on him in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. A wave of emotion swept over him. He realized the cane's movements were more than strange, they were a message. His grandfather had left him a trail, a path through memory and wisdom. It was not just an object, it was a teacher, a guide, a living bridge between the past and the present. Daniel began to notice the subtle signs, the faint scratches on the floors where the cane had rested, the slight indentations in the carpet, the way shadows seemed to bend around it. He could almost hear the echoes of his grandfather's voice in the room, "Follow carefully. Every step counts." Days passed and the routine became ritual. Daniel would wake, make coffee, and check the cane. He would follow it, observing where it led him, reflecting on the memories it conjured. Sometimes it paused by the bookshelf where his grandfather kept old photographs. Other times it stopped by the armchair, facing the garden where they had spent so many afternoons together. Each movement stirred memories Daniel had long buried, bringing joy and sorrow in equal measure. Yet the mystery deepened. One evening, Daniel left the cane by the door while he stepped outside to fetch something from the car. When he returned, the cane had moved again, this time to the center of the hallway, standing upright as though waiting for him. A chill ran down his spine. The house was alive in ways he could not yet comprehend. He decided to follow the cane outside. To his astonishment, it moved across the garden, stopping briefly by the fountain, tracing the path his grandfather had walked daily. Daniel crouched in the grass, heart racing, watching as the cane leaned slightly as if nodding toward him, urging him to follow. It was then he understood. The cane was more than a memory. It was a connection, a guide, and a test. It demanded attention, presence, and reflection. And as Daniel followed it back into the house, he felt a strange comfort. The fear, the grief, and the guilt that had weighed on him for so long began to blend with awe, curiosity, and a renewed sense of purpose. At night, Daniel would sit by the fireplace, the cane leaning nearby, feeling its subtle presence. He could almost sense the wisdom, patience, and care his grandfather had poured into every step he had taken in life. And though he could not see it, Daniel knew the journey was only beginning. The cane would continue to move, continue to guide, and he would have to follow not just through the rooms of the house, but through the memories, regrets, and lessons that had shaped a family across generations. Daniel realized that this was no ordinary object, no simple heirloom. The cane carried a legacy, one of love, guidance, and purpose. And as he placed it carefully in the corner that night, he whispered softly, almost reverently, "I will follow you, wherever you lead." In the quiet house, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, the cane seemed to lean slightly forward as if acknowledging him. Daniel exhaled, a mix of fear, anticipation, and wonder settling deep in his chest. The journey had begun and he was ready to walk it. Daniel had begun to understand that the cane was not merely an object, it was a guide. Its movements were deliberate, precise, and filled with intention. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the tall living room windows, the cane shifted on its own, nudging him toward the study. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He followed silently, careful not to disturb the quiet reverence of the house. The study had always felt like a shrine to his grandfather's life. Shelves of books lined the walls, their spines faded, titles nearly illegible. A worn armchair rested near the window, and an old desk, covered in papers and scattered ink bottles, commanded the room. The cane paused at the desk, leaning against it with a quiet authority. Daniel approached, gently moving papers aside. Beneath a stack of yellowed letters tied together with a fraying ribbon, he discovered the first clue, a letter addressed to a family member he had never met. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's, deliberate and flowing, full of regret and honesty. He read the words and a lump rose in his throat. The letter spoke of apologies never delivered, of mistakes made quietly and alone, of financial struggles hidden from the family to protect them. Daniel's chest tightened. He had always believed his grandfather had a perfect life, unwavering in wisdom and strength. But here, in the fragile pages of ink-stained paper, he discovered the truth. Even the strongest carry burdens, often silently. The cane shifted again, nudging Daniel toward a small cabinet at the corner of the room. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of black and white photographs. Faces stared back at him. His grandfather as a young man, siblings who had long passed, friends whose names Daniel had only heard in stories. One photo in particular stopped him cold. His grandfather standing beside a crumbling building, a faint smile on his face, eyes filled with both hope and sorrow. It was a place Daniel recognized from stories, an old family property that had been abandoned for decades. Daniel's hand lingered on the photograph. The cane shifted slightly, pointing toward a drawer in the desk. Inside he found a journal, its leather cover worn soft from years of use. Opening it, he discovered pages filled with thoughts, reflections, and secrets. The writing revealed struggles Daniel had never known, lost opportunities, unspoken apologies, dreams left unfinished. One entry caught his eye. "I hope someone finds these words someday. Perhaps they will understand why I made the choices I did, and why some things were left unsaid. Family is love, yes, but it is also forgiveness and understanding." A wave of emotion washed over him. Daniel realized that his grandfather had been leaving him a map, not a map of land but a map of the heart. Every secret, every letter, every photograph was a step toward understanding the man he had admired but never truly known. The cane nudged him again, directing him toward a narrow bookshelf tucked into the corner. Behind the books, Daniel discovered a small hidden compartment. Inside were more letters, detailing strained relationships with distant relatives, unspoken resentments, and the careful balancing of hardships to shield the family from worry. Daniel's mind reeled. The man he had idolized had been quietly carrying burdens to protect others, just as he had always carried the cane to guide himself through life. The realization struck Daniel with overwhelming clarity. The cane was not merely a relic, it was an extension of his grandfather's love, patience, and wisdom. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by letters, photographs, and journals, Daniel felt a mixture of grief and awe. The house, once just walls and memories, now seemed alive with intent, filled with the lingering presence of a man who had lived carefully, loved deeply, and taught lessons beyond the reach of words. 4 hours he pored over the materials, piecing together stories he had never known. Each letter revealed a layer of his grandfather's humanity, the fears, the pride, the regrets, and the hope that someone someday would carry forward what he had left behind. Daniel noticed a pattern. The cane always positioned itself near the items of significance. It moved him, nudged him, guided him to the next discovery. It was as though his grandfather had created a trail, a journey that Daniel was meant to follow, to understand not just the man himself, but the choices, sacrifices, and love that had shaped the family. And in that quiet study, Daniel felt something he had never felt before, a connection that transcended grief. The past was no longer distant. It was alive in the cane, in the letters, in the photographs, and in every corner of the house. His grandfather's presence was there, patient and guiding, waiting for Daniel to finally see the depth of what he had left behind. As evening settled, Daniel carefully stacked the letters, leaving the cane leaning nearby. He sat back, staring at it, understanding at last that this was more than a mysterious object. It was a messenger. It had been guiding him to knowledge, to forgiveness, to understanding the love that had always been present but hidden beneath the weight of unspoken truths. He whispered to the cane, softly as if speaking to his grandfather directly, "I understand now. I will follow your path." The cane, upright and still, seemed to respond with a quiet acknowledgement. Daniel felt a surge of resolve. He would honor this legacy piece by piece, step by step. And as he rose to leave the study, he knew that the journey was far from over. There were more paths to follow, more secrets to uncover, and more lessons waiting in the corners of the house, each step guided by the steady presence of the cane. Daniel paused at the doorway, looking back at the study filled with remnants of a life fully lived. A mixture of sorrow and determination filled him. He realized that understanding his grandfather's past was not just about uncovering secrets. It was about connecting with the man he had loved, honoring the legacy left behind, and learning to walk forward with purpose, just as his grandfather had always intended. The cane waited silently in the corner, patient and steadfast. Daniel knew it would continue to guide him, showing the way through the mysteries, the memories, and the love that spanned generations. And with that thought, he stepped into the hallway, ready for whatever the house and the cane would reveal next. The next morning, Daniel stepped outside, the cane leaning against the wall near the front door. He had planned to run a few errands, groceries, a quick stop at the post office, but something tugged at him, an uneasy feeling that left his stomach tight. He glanced down the driveway, then back at the cane. For a brief moment, it seemed heavier than usual, as though waiting, aware of his movements. Shaking off the unease, he hurried to his car, thinking the cane would remain where he had left it. But when he returned an hour later, it was gone. Panic rose instantly. He searched the living room, the hallway, even the garden, calling out, though the house remained silent. And then he saw it. Through the living room window, the cane was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it rolled across the garden path, avoiding stones and leaves as if it knew the terrain better than any human could. Daniel's mouth went dry. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was seeing things, but when he blinked, it was still there, upright, walking with a steady rhythm. Heart pounding, he ran outside. The cane paused, as though acknowledging his presence, then continued, moving toward the old fountain in the center of the garden. Daniel followed, careful not to rush it, careful not to frighten it. His mind raced. How is this possible? What is it doing? Neighbors were beginning to notice. From across the street, Mrs. Thompson waved, frowning. Daniel? Everything okay? She called. He forced a nervous smile. Yes, just checking the garden. He didn't explain, couldn't explain. The cane was moving with purpose, independent, intelligent, and he felt both awe and terror. By late afternoon, the cane had circled the garden, paused near the old oak tree, and then as the sun began to dip, it moved back toward the house. Daniel followed silently, trying to keep up without touching it. The cane led him along familiar paths, over stones that had been walked for decades, tracing footsteps he could barely remember. For the first time, the supernatural was undeniable. The cane was alive in some way he could not explain, yet not frightening. It moved as if guided by a will he could sense but not see. Every movement felt like a message: observe, learn, follow. The day after, Daniel tried leaving the house for errands again. He parked a few streets away, returned an hour later, and the cane had vanished. He searched the living room, the hallway, the garden, but it was gone. Fear gnawed at him. Where could it have gone? He stepped outside and saw it, leaning against the lamppost at the corner, casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. It had moved along the streets, slow and deliberate, then paused, waiting for him to notice. Daniel's heart raced. The cane was guiding him beyond the house, beyond the safety of familiar walls. As days passed, this became routine. Daniel would leave, and the cane would always find a way outside, moving along quiet streets, across gardens, sometimes pausing at places he recognized from childhood, spots his grandfather had loved, areas where he had taken him to play or to talk. People began noticing. A delivery man stopped in front of the house one morning, frowning. "Is that a walking stick moving on its own?" he muttered. Daniel froze, unsure whether to laugh or panic. Mrs. Thompson's cat hissed as the cane passed by, as if even animals could sense its presence. Daniel's feelings were conflicted. Fear, certainly, but also awe, gratitude, and a growing sense of connection. The cane was more than supernatural. It was a messenger, a link to his grandfather, guiding him not only through the house but through memory, understanding, and legacy. He began following it closely, documenting every movement, noting patterns, and observing behavior. He realized the cane led him to overlooked places in the neighborhood. The bench where his grandfather had once fed birds, the small garden plot behind the church he had loved, the corner of the park where they had played chess. Each place held a memory, a lesson, a story he had never known or fully appreciated. And every time the cane returned to the house by nightfall, it leaned patiently against the wall, as if silently acknowledging him. Daniel felt something stirring deep inside, a sense of companionship, of guidance, of being watched over without fear. The cane was teaching him to notice, to remember, to follow in his grandfather's footsteps, even in the spaces outside the house. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch watching it move across the garden, he whispered to himself, "I don't understand how, but I trust you." The cane paused briefly, upright and still as if it had heard him. Daniel felt a shiver of understanding. The journey was no longer just about the house, the letters, or the journals. It was about life itself, his grandfather's past, his own present, and the invisible paths that connected them. For the first time, Daniel felt that weight, the weight of responsibility, of love, of legacy. He realized that the cane had been waiting for him all along, guiding him toward lessons he was finally ready to learn. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets, Daniel knew one thing with certainty. He could no longer ignore the call. The cane was not merely an object. It was a companion, a guide, and a teacher. That night, as he returned inside, Daniel touched the cane lightly. Its polished surface felt warm under his hand, almost like a heartbeat. He whispered softly, "I will follow, wherever you lead." The cane leaned slightly as if acknowledging him, ready for the next step. And in the quiet house, the city streets beyond, and the spaces in between, Daniel understood that the journey had moved beyond memory and grief. It was now a living, breathing path, stretching from the past into the future, guided by a simple, steady presence that refused to be ignored. The cane had been restless that morning. It shifted from the living room to the hallway with unusual urgency, almost dragging Daniel along with its silent insistence. Something about its movement felt urgent, deliberate, different from its usual steady pace. Daniel followed without question, a mixture of apprehension and anticipation coiling in his chest. It led him down familiar streets, past the park, past the church, past the bench his grandfather had loved. But today the path stretched further, toward the outskirts of town, to a place Daniel had never ventured. A place his grandfather had spoken of only once, in passing. A family property abandoned for decades, where laughter, celebration, and sorrow had once mingled beneath the same roof. As Daniel approached, he felt a cold prickle of unease. The property was a shadow of its former self. Crumbling walls, overgrown gardens, and shattered windows marked the passage of time. A heavy sense of history hung in the air, thick and almost tangible. The cane paused at the edge of the yard, upright as if waiting for him to enter. Daniel hesitated. Memories stirred, his grandfather's voice, soft yet insistent. "Some things must be faced, Daniel. Some steps cannot be skipped." Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, following the cane across the uneven ground, careful not to stumble. Inside, the house felt like a vessel for the past. Dust choked the air and sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting long, fractured shadows. The smell of decay mingled with the faint scent of old wood and memories. As Daniel stepped through the doorway, he felt it, a presence overwhelming yet comforting, like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. And then it began. A vision, vivid and consuming, filled the room. Daniel saw his grandfather as a young man, laughing with family members, organizing the house, celebrating birthdays and holidays. The joy was tangible, almost suffocating in its intensity. Then the vision shifted. He saw arguments, silent tears, financial worries whispered behind closed doors, the unspoken tensions that had shaped decisions, choices that had left scars both visible and hidden. Daniel gasped. He could see the weight his grandfather had carried, the sacrifices made to protect loved ones, the regrets that had never been spoken aloud. The man he had idolized was human, flawed, burdened, and deeply committed to the family's well-being. Every smile, every frown, every whispered apology now made sense. The cane leaned toward a doorway. Daniel followed, stepping into another room. Here the vision grew more intense. He saw his grandfather pacing, a young Daniel playing nearby, laughter echoing in the air. Then he saw mistakes, trust broken, promises left unfulfilled, moments of fear and doubt. And yet, in the midst of it all, he saw hope, love, and persistence. His grandfather had done what he could, leaving behind a path to guide those who came after. Daniel fell to his knees, overwhelmed. He whispered, tears spilling down his cheeks, I understand now. I see you. I see everything you carried for us." The vision shifted one last time. His grandfather appeared not just in memory but as a presence, radiant, patient, and steady. The man's eyes held sorrow, pride, and boundless love. He did not speak, he did not need to. The message was clear. The cane, the letters, the hidden journals, and the journey itself had all been preparation. Daniel was ready to understand, to forgive, to accept the legacy of a life lived with intention, wisdom, and love. Daniel reached for the cane. It stood upright, solid, grounding him in the midst of the vision. The wood felt warmer than ever, almost alive, as though affirming everything he had realized. He could feel the pulse of history, the heartbeat of generations, coursing through its smooth surface. He thought of his own life, of regrets, of distance, of opportunities missed. But standing there, guided by the cane, he understood that it was not too late. Legacy was not just about the past, it was about what he chose to carry forward. The lessons, the love, the wisdom, they were his now, entrusted to him, ready to shape his steps, his decisions, and his heart. The visions faded, leaving Daniel alone in the quiet, abandoned house. The cane leaned against the wall, upright and patient, as if waiting for him to rise and walk forward. He touched it gently, feeling a warmth that spread through him, steadying his resolve. Daniel rose, his knees stiff but his heart lightened. He stepped outside into the fading sunlight, feeling the weight of the past, yes, but also the clarity of purpose. The abandoned property, once a place of sorrow and neglect, now felt sacred. It had been a test, a journey through memory and emotion, designed to prepare him for understanding, forgiveness, and action. He looked at the cane and whispered, "I see you now. I see the path, and I will walk it." The cane moved slightly as if acknowledging him. Daniel smiled through tears. For the first time in years he felt a sense of alignment, grief transformed into understanding, guilt replaced by clarity, fear softened by purpose. As he walked back toward the main road, following the cane's steady lead, Daniel reflected on everything he had learned. The journey had been about more than moving objects or exploring old houses. It had been about confronting the past, his grandfather's past, his own past, and the legacy that connected them. Every step he took was no longer just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, and transformative. By the time he reached the edge of the property, the sun had set, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The cane paused at the gate, upright and steadfast. Daniel placed a hand on it, feeling a deep gratitude swell inside. He knew that the journey was far from over, but now, armed with understanding and connection, he was ready. The turning point had come. The confrontation with the past had revealed truths both painful and beautiful. And in that revelation, Daniel discovered not just the depth of his grandfather's love, but the enduring power of family, memory, and legacy. As he stepped onto the road leading home, Daniel felt the cane move slightly forward, nudging him onward. And in that small motion he understood fully, the journey was not about fear or mystery anymore. It was about walking forward, carrying lessons, love, and guidance that span generations. And for the first time, Daniel felt that he could truly honor his grandfather, not by holding on to grief, but by living with purpose, understanding, and the wisdom the cane had patiently revealed. The walk home felt different. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the streets with warm, golden light, and for the first time, Daniel felt that the world around him mirrored the clarity he had gained inside. The cane led him steadily, not hurriedly, but with quiet confidence, guiding him back to the house that had been the starting point of his journey, both physically and emotionally. As he approached the familiar gate, the house seemed to welcome him. The windows caught the last rays of sunlight, glowing softly as though acknowledging his return. Daniel paused at the doorstep, hand resting on the cane, feeling the weight of every step, every memory, and every lesson. The house was more than walls and furniture. It was a vessel of legacy, of love, of life lived fully and carefully. He entered, and the air inside felt different, infused with the presence of his grandfather, still guiding him. The cane moved slightly, nudging him toward the study. Daniel followed, noticing the letters he had read, the journals he had explored, and the photographs he had studied. Everything now seemed alive with meaning. Each object was no longer just a memory but a link, a lesson, a story waiting to be remembered and honored. In the study, Daniel carefully gathered the family mementos. Letters were stacked neatly, photographs framed where possible, and journals placed in order. Every item had a place, every memory a voice. The cane leaned nearby, silent but present, like a steady companion approving of the work he was doing. Daniel paused, looking around the room. The once quiet house felt vibrant with history. The walls seemed to hum, echoing laughter, tears, and conversations long past. For the first time, Daniel felt that he was not alone in this process. His grandfather's presence was tangible, not in sight but in feeling. A warmth in the air, a comfort in his chest, a silent approval in every breath he took. He picked up one of the letters and began reading aloud, his voice soft but steady. It told stories of joy and sorrow, hope and regret, the kind of wisdom that could only come from a lifetime of experience. Daniel read for hours, letting each word sink into him, connecting the past to the present, grief to understanding, and memory to action. The cane stood nearby, upright and patient as if listening along. At one point, Daniel stepped into the living room. He arranged the armchairs, placed the photographs on the mantel, and brushed dust from the shelves. The house felt alive, balanced between past and present. And finally he approached the grandfather's favorite chair. The cane, as if understanding the significance, moved gently toward it and leaned upright in the corner beside the seat. Daniel watched, heart heavy with emotion. The cane had completed its journey, guiding him, teaching him, connecting him to the man he had loved and lost. It had led him to understanding not just of the past but of himself, his family, and the legacy that stretched beyond grief into wisdom and love. He sat in the chair, the cane within reach, and allowed himself to reflect. For years he had carried guilt for distance, for missed opportunities, for failing to fully know the man who had shaped him. Now he felt that weight lift, replaced by understanding, appreciation, and connection. The house was quiet but not lonely. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through the windows, felt like a conversation with the past, a reminder that life, memory, and legacy were continuous threads. Daniel traced the polished wood of the cane, feeling warmth and purpose. He understood now that this object had been more than a walking aid. It had been a teacher, a guide, and a bridge to the love and wisdom his grandfather had cultivated over a lifetime. He rose and moved through the house, touching the places where the cane had guided him, silently acknowledging the lessons learned. Each step was deliberate, respectful, and filled with gratitude. He could feel the presence of his grandfather in the patterns of movement, the small imperfections of the furniture, the familiar arrangement of the rooms, all reminders that life, love, and family were deeply connected. Daniel spent the rest of the day restoring what had been neglected: the garden, the shelves, the small decorative touches his grandfather had once arranged. Every action was a tribute, every careful movement a way to honor what had come before. The cane remained nearby, upright, patient, a quiet sentinel overseeing the restoration of both home and heart. As evening fell, Daniel placed the last photograph on the mantel. He stepped back and took in the living room, the study, the garden visible through the windows. The house was whole again, not in its physical structure alone but in its spirit. The past and present were aligned, grief transformed into understanding and memory into love. Finally he approached the cane one last time that night. Its polished surface gleamed in the soft lamplight. He touched it gently, a gesture of gratitude, respect, and recognition. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "For everything. For showing me, guiding me, for being here." The cane leaned slightly as though acknowledging him, standing upright in the corner near the grandfather's favorite chair. Daniel smiled, tears in his eyes. It no longer felt eerie, supernatural, or unsettling. It was simply at peace, its journey complete, its purpose fulfilled. Daniel stepped outside for the first time in weeks, carrying a lightness in his chest. The garden, the streets, the sky, all felt more vibrant, alive, and full of possibility. He had learned to honor the past, embrace the present, and walk forward with purpose. The cane had been more than a guide, it had been a teacher, showing him the steps to understanding, forgiveness, and connection. He looked back at the house, now quiet and still, a sanctuary filled with memory and love. The cane, standing near the chair, was a symbol of endurance, guidance, and the invisible threads that connect generations. Daniel realized that life would continue, challenges would arise, but he now carried the wisdom, presence, and love of his grandfather within him. For the first time he left the house without fear, without hesitation. He walked into the night carrying the lessons of the cane, the stories of the past, and the knowledge that love, legacy, and guidance endure beyond presence and time. And in the quiet house, the cane remained upright, a sentinel of history, a teacher at rest, and a reminder that the path forward was always guided by those who came before, silently, patiently, with love and wisdom in every step. The house was quiet now, filled with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. Daniel sat in his grandfather's favorite chair, the cane leaning gently nearby, upright and patient, like a faithful companion that had completed its duty. The journey was over, and yet it was only the beginning of understanding what it meant to carry a legacy. He thought back to the first day he had returned, the day he had stood in the empty living room, overwhelmed by grief and regret. Back then he had not realized how much he had missed, not just his grandfather but the depth of connection, the wisdom hidden in small moments, and the silent lessons waiting in the corners of the house. Now every step he had taken, every discovery, every vision felt purposeful. Every letter, photograph, and journal entry had been a thread, weaving him into the tapestry of family history. Daniel rose and moved through the house, touching the objects, inhaling the familiar scents of old wood and paper, feeling the life and love that had once filled these walls. Each item was a story, each corner a memory. And the cane, steadfast and serene, reminded him that the past was not gone. It lived on in understanding, in action, in the lessons he would carry forward. He thought of the letters he had read aloud, the photographs he had restored, and the journals that revealed his grandfather's struggles and wisdom. Daniel realized that grief had not vanished, it had transformed. Fear and regret had given way to clarity, and loneliness had become connection. The past was not a weight to bear but a guide to walk by step, with purpose and love. In the days that followed, Daniel reached out to family members he had drifted from over the years. He shared stories of his grandfather, the lessons he had learned from the cane, and the letters and journals that revealed a side of their shared history none of them had fully known. Conversations were tentative at first, filled with silence and emotion, but slowly they opened. Laughter returned. Tears were shed. Apologies were offered and received. The house, once silent and somber, now hummed with the energy of reconciliation and renewed connection. Neighbors began to notice the change too. Daniel walked through the garden, arranging flowers and trimming branches, the cane resting nearby as it had throughout the house. It seemed to belong here at peace, a symbol of everything he had learned. Children waved from across the street and he waved back, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he had been missing. The neighborhood, once distant and quiet, now felt like part of a living, breathing community that carried echoes of the past into the present. One evening, Daniel stood by the window looking at the cane resting near the chair. He remembered the first time he had held it, how heavy it had felt, almost alive in his hands, and how, over weeks, it had led him through discovery, grief, and understanding. He smiled softly, a mixture of gratitude and reverence. The cane had been more than an object. It had been a guide, a companion, and a teacher. It had carried the wisdom of generations, offering patience and clarity to someone willing to follow its lead. He remembered the abandoned family property, the visions of his grandfather, and the lessons learned there. All of it had prepared him not just to understand the past, but to live in the present with intention. Daniel realized that legacy was not just what one leaves behind, it was what one teaches, what one shares, and what one nurtures in those who come after. And now he felt ready to carry it forward. Daniel began to document everything he had learned. Letters were copied, photographs cataloged, and journals carefully preserved. He made notes of the paths the cane had taken, the places it had guided him, and the memories it had unearthed. He did this not only for himself but for future generations, so that they too might understand the man behind the cane, the love he had carried, and the lessons he had left for those willing to listen. Time passed, and the house became a place of reflection and growth. Daniel often sat by the window with the cane nearby, sipping tea, watching the sunlight dance across the garden. He thought of his grandfather with fondness, not sadness. The grief that had once consumed him had transformed into gratitude, and the fear of loss had become a connection that transcended time. The cane remained upright in its corner, silent yet alive with meaning. It was no longer a mystery, no longer a source of fear or wonder, but a symbol, a tangible reminder of the invisible ties of family, love, and wisdom. Daniel understood that these ties did not vanish with death. They endured, quietly guiding those willing to follow, teaching patience, reflection, and the value of legacy. One afternoon, Daniel invited his siblings and cousins to the house. They sat together in the living room, sharing stories and memories of their grandfather. Daniel passed around letters and photographs, explaining the significance of each item, recounting the journey of discovery and understanding that had changed him. Laughter mixed with tears, conversations deepened, and walls that had once separated them emotionally began to crumble. The family, once fragmented by distance and unspoken conflicts, was beginning to knit itself together again. After everyone had left, Daniel sat alone in the study. The cane rested near the chair, its polished surface catching the fading sunlight. He ran a hand along its smooth surface, feeling warmth and continuity. He whispered softly, "Thank you for showing me, for being there when I needed you most." The house was quiet, peaceful, and full of meaning. Daniel knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he also knew that he carried the wisdom of generations, the lessons of patience and guidance, and the love that had been quietly waiting for him all along. The cane would remain, a sentinel and a teacher, silently watching over the home, a reminder that the past and present were never truly separate. As he stepped outside that evening, breathing in the crisp air, Daniel felt a profound sense of calm. The garden was quiet, the sky streaked with orange and pink hues. The streets beyond were calm, familiar, and alive with possibilities. He understood now that his grandfather's legacy was not confined to letters, photographs, or even the cane. It was living in him, in the choices he made, in the family he nurtured, and in the lessons he would continue to pass down. The cane remained in the house, upright and patient, a symbol of enduring guidance. Daniel smiled, knowing that while the journey had reached a conclusion, its lessons would live on, not just for him but for anyone willing to listen, to observe, and to carry forward the legacy of love, patience, and understanding. And as he closed the door behind him, stepping into the evening with a heart unburdened and open, Daniel knew one undeniable truth. Grief had been transformed into gratitude, fear had become connection, and loneliness had been replaced by legacy. The cane waited silently in the quiet house, a steadfast reminder that guidance and love, once given, never truly fade. They endure, quietly, patiently, invisibly, but always present for those willing to follow.